Hello and welcome to a very special Thanksgiving Day album review. And today I am reviewing, finally, Sermons of the Sinner, the first and debut album from K.K. Downing's KK's Priest, which was released through EX1 Records on October 1st. So without further ado, let me get into my honest thoughts on Sermons of the Sinner. Let's get into it. Okay, so before I really get into any of my overall thoughts or any sort of information, basically leading into this album, or at least about this album, you know what I have to do? I have to do a track listing rundown so I can tell you folks what are the songs on this album, how many songs are on this album, and what is the time length for this album. And since we have at least about, technically 10 songs, so it's 9 actual songs, it basically all clocks in at least 50 minutes and 30 seconds. So these 10 songs are beginning with the 58 more so melodramatic intro that is titled Incarnation, then going to Hellfire Thunderbolt, the title track, Sacerdote y Diablo, which is actually Spanish for priest and devil, Raise Your Fists, Brothers of the Road, Metal Through and Through, Wild and Free, Hail for the Priests, and then finally ending with Return of the Sentinel. So there's your 10 songs, or at least 9 actual songs for this album. So, for Sermons of the Sinner, this, of course, again, it is the very first album from, of course, the now since ex-Judas Priest alumni, K.K. Downing. This is his first album going solo now, again, after retirement. Says he again, I've at least gave my opinions and thoughts on his overall thoughts, whatnot, over at least a year or so. I've at least said my piece about what I thought about how he felt about the whole Judas Priest situation. He claims it wasn't much retirement. It was. He said it clear as day back in at least 2011 or 12, you know, around the Epitaph tour. He said it was a fucking retirement, and it was. But now he's claiming it wasn't a retirement, but I've said all of that on my podcast episodes, so I don't really need to repeat any of that. But I do need to at least dive into at least the overall, I guess you can say, the backstory for KK's Priest and how this even formed. It was originally just called Mega Priest in 2019 when he kind of helped form some of these. It was like a super group, basically, with at least David Ellefson and, of course, AJ Mills, and of course Tim Owens and Tony Newton. That was and of course Les Binks. That was at least a lineup for Mega Priest, and then eventually when David Ellefson left, the name Mega was obviously dropped, and KK decided to just rename it as, well, KK's Priest. And so the lineup for this was pretty much at least him. Actually, you know what? Tony Newton, I think, was the one that actually ended up replacing David Ellefson, so I apologize about that. Either way, he replaces David Ellefson, and this is at least was the lineup before until somehow I think it's been stated that Les Binks ended up injuring his hands or something, and that's why he had to get replaced by Sean Elg, so who was the drummer for at least the album. And it might be the member going forward. So this at least is now your lineup here. Again, KK Downing, Tim Owens, Tony Newton on bass, AJ Mills, and then Sean Elg on drums and Tony Newton. So there's at least your lineup for Sermons of the Sinner. So, where do I really begin with my thoughts on Sermons of the Sinner? Where do I really begin? I know at one point I was planning on buying this album, and I might eventually will, but it's not going to be, at this point, an immediate buy. I don't want to come off like a complete downer, but you're probably are going to get that, that I might end up, or at least you might feel, in a way, personally, that I'm probably going to be a bit of a downer in my review for this album. Well, I'll just at least run through at least what were my first impressions of when songs like, again, like the title track, Hellfire Thunderbolt, and Brothers of the Road, maybe even Raise Your Fist, I think was also one of the songs that were released too. But when these songs were first released, my first impressions were very lukewarm. I wasn't a complete fan. I didn't really care much for what I was really hearing. And again, I know that some have their very independent opinions, especially when it comes to Tin Owens. Some think that he's probably a little bit trying too hard to really sound like Rob Halford. I mean, it's probably more so than I think what they wanted him to sound originally when he joined Judas Priest in the mid-90s. Again, for like Jugulator and then Demolition. But here, he is definitely showing that he is at least was a capable of really singing that sort of classic Judas Priest sound. But for some reason, I guess some people felt like he's a little bit, I guess, trying way too hard, and that kind of comes across at times. Again, I wasn't a big. I just didn't really feel songs like Hellfire Thunderbolt, the title track, and Brothers of the Road. I didn't really feel much of these songs, and I still am kind of not feeling these three songs as much, especially for a song like Brothers of the Road, which I think might be one of the most mediocre songs on the entire album, maybe next to Wild and Free. But Hellfire Thunderbolt, I think, is a fine song, so I'm going to run through at least what are my positives in terms of mostly at least songs I really like. The ones that really that jumped out at me as being standout songs that I actually can get into for the most part, I'll have to say has to be Raise Your Fists. For some reason, this was a song that kind of just grew on me with at least the listens and whatnot of repeating listens. This was what one of the earliest songs I was starting to really kind of get into. Then, of course, into like Metal Through and Through. Again, some of the titles on some of these songs are very cut rate. And again, you can tell that I think comes across as trying a little too hard to compete with the level of at least his own former band, Judas Priest. So it kind of comes across that. But again, you can't really judge a book box by its cover because of, again, the titles. They're not really extraordinary or any sort of, again, it's not supposed to be thought-provoking. It's never the point or the idea. But at the same time, they're not the most imaginative kind of at least titles. There was at least something to the quirkiness of the titles for Judas Priest songs. These come off a little too much like a tribute band thinking what a original song title for a Judas Priest song should at least be titled. That's what it comes across here, and that's how I feel. But again, beyond that, the songs are not bad at all. Again, Metal Through and Through, again, besides this kind of corny song title, is a fine song in its own right. It's actually the first of the really long songs on the album, save for at least Return of the Sentinel. It clocks in at least at 8 minutes and 13 seconds, and it's got some interesting, it kind of does begin very almost 70s like Priest in a way, before it really goes into more of a, almost, I was going to say, maybe more a Ram It Down or Painkiller sort of era Judas Priest song, but it has some time changes a bit. And it's very interesting. And again, it ends on an interesting note as well, very calmly. But again, it's supposed to give a very epic kind of feel. The one band I actually can compare some of this stuff to, besides maybe late 80s Priest, has to at times be Manowar. There's somehow, I almost feel like, especially when it comes to the really corny kind of songs, which I'll get into, it seems like KK Downing might have been a big fan of Manowar. And I'm at times almost talking about later day period Manowar in terms of just the way he's structuring some of these songs. Of course, besides the fucking song titles for these tracks, he definitely seemed to have been a huge fan of Manowar, and he tends to, some of that, I think, really kind of bled into, I think, the writing of the sound. And it seems like maybe he might have a little bit of amnesia and seems to confuse classic Judas Priest for fucking Manowar. So who knows what the deal is there, but that's kind of the way it comes off. But it is a little, again, that might seem as a complete knock, maybe a bit to a kind of a burn there. I didn't mean that as a negative, but it just comes off that way. And again, it's one of the better songs, though. Again, Metal Through and Through is one of the better songs besides its corny title, like I keep saying. Hails of the Priest is another sort of, I think, interesting track. It's fine. It's a heavier song, but I like it. Again, it's one of the ones I really can say is a pretty good song off the album. Then, of course, the last one has to be Sacerdote y Diablo. Again, hopefully I pronounced that one again, the first time around I pronounced it correctly. But Sacerdote y Diablo, again, Spanish for priest and devil, is actually, again, even one of the earliest songs really got into the most, actually, off the album. The one that really stuck out at me the most. It's actually one of the interesting ones. Besides, I mean, I guess you can say when it comes to really corny song titles, maybe I think KK Downing made the right choice in actually choosing at least a Spanish title for at least one of the songs on the album. I guess he kind of thought if he just titled Priest and Devil, it would have been a little bit too, I guess you can say, self-explanatory. But him choosing the Spanish word for at least Priest and Devil I think, was a unique choice, and I think it kind of works in this case, and actually makes the song a little more interesting in that matter. Again, it's not like that any of these songs are like groundbreaking or they're thought-provoking, but at least there's something interesting behind that. So that's pretty much all the positives I can say. The negatives, again, I think there's probably a lot more mediocre kind of songs on the album. Again, I'm not very big on Brothers of the Road. It's very cut rate. I think Wild and Free is, again, the kind of, again, to at least revisit the sort of Manowar comparisons. I think Wild and Free has to be the one where it's, I think, where Metal Through and Through might be the best of the sort of Manowar comparisons I can give this album. Wild and Free is the worst. This is probably, to me, the worst of at least the Manowar comparisons, because again, this really reminds me of later day Manowar, and that's not a good thing, because I don't really care much for later day Manowar, especially when it comes within the 2000s. It's too much trying to be melodramatic. It's trying to be, yeah, we're fucking metal, this and that, but it just comes off cheesy and corny and fucking hokey, and I think it kind of falls flat on the entire disc. So again, it's one of my really least favorite songs off the album. And then, of course, we get to Return of the Sentinel, which should have been, this should have been a winner, just because of it supposedly is a sequel to the song The Sentinel off the Defenders of the Faith, one of my favorite songs off of one of my favorite 80s era Priest albums. However, I was so fucking underwhelmed by the result for Return of the Sentinel. Again, this is the absolute longest song on the album, because it basically barely hits 9-minute mark, and it should have been good, but it's so goddamn lukewarm, and actually at times it just comes off kind of cold because of it's not anywhere interesting. This should have almost had the same overall atmosphere. It should have had the same pacing of at least a track like The Sentinel. It should have been. It's a fucking sequel. It should have been treated like that. When Riot did, at least for Riot V, when they at least made a sequel to the song Outlaw and called it Return of the Outlaw on the Unleash the Fire album, it at least sounded like a pretty good successor to Outlaw off of Fire Down Under. It had the same essence, the same sort of riff feel, and the pacing. It felt like a proper sequel because it had the similar feel. This, KK Downing, in his eyes, he thought it was, I think, an interesting idea to kind of create a sequel track, but somehow make it feel different. But in this case, I think he kind of fell a little flat on this one too. And it just comes off kind of underwhelming, especially when it ends. This is the song that ends the album, and it's on a kind of a down point, in my opinion. So it's one of the low points for the album. And probably when finally just get into it, since I ran through some of the songs I think that kind of are not very interesting on the entire album, has to be the production. I think, if anything, one of my, might be what could be my lukewarmness towards the album and where I kind of feel about the songs maybe could be judged off the fact that I think the production and the mixing and at times the recording on the album is so fucking undercooked. I mean, yes, it's far better than, let's say, the production on, let's say, an album like Redeemer of Souls from, of course, his former band Judas Priest. But at the same time, it's not saying much, especially when compared to, let's say, other bands. I mean, I've kind of said I had a similar feel toward, let's say, an album like Game Over from Udo's band, Udio. But the difference is, compared to this one, the production on that one sounds massive compared to the production here on Sermons of the Sinner. And again, you can say it probably falls into the same trope or the same hole that Judas Priest falls in when it comes to their production jobs. Because Judas Priest weren't really the best band for, or at least the most known band, or weren't known for the greatest high-end production jobs. At times they always had issues with production and everything. It's why some people have always had an issue becoming massive fans of Judas Priest at times, is because of the production always kind of came off very lukewarm and but at least the songwriting was always had a way of saving those albums, and I think that's should have been the case here. And again, KK Downing, I feel like, has had all the ingredients, but somehow, again, if you to kind of use an example or an analogy for this would be if you ever bought those microwavable mug cake cups or something, or called mug cakes, which again, they give you every bit of the ingredients, they give you directions how to at least to properly prepare and mix in at least prepare the whole mug cakes, and then what would be the correct time to microwave the mug cakes for. It's almost like a person who's doesn't read much of the box, doesn't care for, and thinks that he knows how to cook. And so instead, he prepares it his way. But instead, you put in the milk, you put in all the powdered packaging, whatever, into the cup. You think you've mixed it all correctly, but then you shove it into the microwave, and then you press the correct timing. I guess that's the one thing you probably can say that you probably looked at was the time. Well, as you probably hit in that correct time, then you take out the mug cake. You can tell already, wait a minute, this is not right. It didn't cook right. That's the same way I feel about Sermons of the Sinner. It didn't get cooked or baked enough. It didn't get baked right. And that's how I kind of feel about at least the album here, especially for the songs. If it had at least slightly better production, and I think the songs, even though it would have saved them completely, but at least would have made them more presentable, and at least I would have had a better sort of judgment on at least the album. But I think, again, the production job and the mixing is not very good on this album, and I think, again, musically, there's some good songs, but again, because of the already plain as day kind of hokey, mediocre writing, the production job on this album, I think, if anything, exposes the kind of already there mediocre writing. Again, I feel like KK Downing tried a little too hard to really kind of recapture the spirit of his old band, but I think failed. That's the difference between, let's say, Udo and Accept. I think Udo has had a better understanding of really capturing or keeping the spirit of old Accept alive than at least Accept these days. But yet, on the other hand, it's the reverse between KK Downing and, of course, his former band Judas Priest. Maybe, again, this is the first album, but I feel like in many ways I think Judas Priest has some of his stuff beaten. And I'm sorry to say that, and it kind of hurts me because, again, KK Downing was one of my favorite guitar players that come out of Judas Priest, and this is a little bit underwhelming for me, and I'm sorry. There we go. It's not a terrible record by any means, but it's nowhere near what should have been great on, well, probably sounded great on paper, but the results didn't turn out correctly And I think, again, that's just where I'm at in terms of my thoughts on this album. Again, besides, again, at least 4 good songs, the rest of the album kind of falls in the place between decent to kind of just very average to mediocre kind of stuff. So there we go. There it is, folks. There's my overall honest opinion on Sermons of the Sinner. Again, it's an okay album, but it's not great, and that's why I'm giving it the rating of a 7.85 out of 10. Again, it's a decent record, but it's nowhere near the best thing I think Kega Downing has ever released. Again, especially when you're trying to put this on the same pedestal or trying to have the same sort of eyes or the ears that you kind of have for at least the earlier albums that Kega Downing has released or recorded. You know, with at least his band Judas Priest, you're trying to have those kind of eyes or those ears for at least his new material, but again, it just doesn't sound right. So that's where I'm at. You can disagree all you want, but again, that's at least you're free to. You can feel free to at least to voice your opinion in the comments section below. But if you, in a way, kind of agree, again, it depends on if you like the album or you didn't like them. You can post all of that in the comments section below. So at that, hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.